Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Those of you who have had long weekends will appreciate today, I think, because when we were all in school as youngsters, we loved the occasional snow day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And the next best thing to that was when you had a substitute teacher.
Yeah.
And the substitute teacher would oftentimes be left with movies or videos to show. You're not getting one video today, you're getting three.
Oh,
But they all are interrelated. And so I wanted you to get them all because we are switching now from poetry to narrative. And we will be dealing with plot, character, and setting, all of which are super important in our understanding of these narrative stories, because like poetry, or like the poetry that we've already looked at, this is not our narrative, this is narrative of times gone by. We tend to read our narrative differently than they did. Things that were important to them, we may just zip right on by and not get the full impact of. Because we're used to, a lot of our reading is, no matter how you feel about the media, is factual. It's written that way. What's the newspaper term? Who, what, when, where, how? And of course, the least important thing, why? They didn't write like that in the Bible. In any of the styles of narrative that we will encounter, that they had their own systems and their own seeming rules on biblical narrative. Let me start off by sharing this portion with you. Biblical narrative makes up nearly half the Bible. In their basic form, narratives have characters in a setting going through a series of events, and their primary goal is to communicate a theological message through the medium of the story. Translation, Bible stories are how you learn about what the faith means and how it impacts your life. And faith stories in and of themselves are not typical of like a newspaper story. One of the things we do, especially in teaching young people the Bible, is we try and give them handles to hold on to. And I'll be hitting this point again later in the Bible, in this particular Bible series, but probably other ones too. So we've always had that poster, you know, where it says the Bible is a library, and it shows all these different books in the Bible. That's probably not a good idea. The Bible probably should be taught as the Bible is a book. And what do books have? Chapters. Books have chapters. But what does a book usually do? Tell one story. The Bible is telling one story. Who is the only character in the Bible that is in every single book of the Bible?
the Lord.
That's right, God. God. God is the main character of the Bible. Now, I know we go through parts of it where the Lord is almost hardly mentioned. You look at the Joseph stories, you know, a few times, not often. But God is the main character, and in some ways, this is God and human beings' stories. But the human beings change because, let's face it, we live for so long and then we are gone. But God is constant. God is always there. So in our more adult understanding of the Bible, let's start thinking of the Bible as a book, not a library. Because libraries, you can check out one book and never touch the rest of them. We don't want to do that. Because if the Bible's one book, how many stories is it telling, essentially? One that has a whole bunch of different parts. One story that has a whole bunch of different parts. Now, why am I banging on the table so hard for this? Because if you're like me, and I have a feeling you are, you self-edit when you read the Bible because there are parts of it you love and there are parts of it you find confusing and frustrating. Well, you know, when you get an instruction manual, there are parts of it that are confusing and frustrating. But if you don't read them, you may not know how to operate the machinery at all. And so I'm not saying we have to read all parts of the Bible equally, because often we're going for comfort, and when we want comfort, we want the familiar. But we need to be familiar with all of these parts, at least enough to see the unity of the story. One of the beautiful things about the Bible is it repeats itself constantly, and we'll be talking about that, especially here in narrative. We did some in poetry, but the narrative, the themes keep coming up over and over again. All right. When we read biblical narratives, we're not watching security camera footage of these ancient events. We are reading an artistic, literary representation of the story of Israel. The goal isn't just to tell us about something that happened, but also help us to discern the meanings of these events. How many Gospels are there? 4. Do they all tell the exact same story?
No.
No.
They're being related and telling to different types of audiences.
We talk about there being 2 types of Gospels, the Synoptics and John. The stories are not the same. The timelines are not even the same. John indicates with his telling of what events were happening that Jesus' ministry lasted how long?
3 years.
3 years. The Synoptic Gospels, in telling the timeline of the events, indicates that Jesus' ministry was 1 year. 1 year. That's not very long.
No.
All right. The Synoptic Gospels, although they have a similarity, are also very different from one another. Yeah, and you've heard these things before. Mark, short, action-packed. Matthew seems incredibly concerned about something that didn't even exist when Jesus was alive, which was the church. Well, a preacher might feel that way. But he wants to talk about how what Jesus says affects the church. Luke, on the other hand, not being Jewish at all, has a more universal view of who Christ is. So instead of saying, blessed are the poor in spirit, he says, blessed are the poor. Because he's thinking in terms of all peoples, including those who may have had no religious training whatsoever before the event of Jesus Christ. And John, bless his heart, is out there. He believes in telling long stories. A lot of times, as you look at the stories in John, they take up a whole chapter. There's a lot of conversation, very few miracles in John. And Jesus, in some ways, almost becomes a poet-philosopher, but certainly recognized by John as the Son of God. So, why are they different if they're telling the same story?
They're approaching different audiences. I mean,
Different audiences. What else?
Matthew was talking about Jewish who knew, all the Jewish traditions.
Different audiences. What's the most basic? Different people. It's 4 different people. Okay. What else? Different time periods. While we think Luke and Matthew may have been written somewhat contemporaneously, Mark comes before both of them, and John comes well after both of them. So different time periods, different interests. They all have different interests, as we were just saying. So there's a lot of things that differentiate these Gospels. And that's what they're saying here, that we, when we are reading the Bible, we need to take into account that we're not reading a newspaper story. We are not watching a piece of film that's showing an event. What we're reading is the written word of people who may have had an experience, even a viewing experience of the event, but for good or bad, what does every human being come with?
A soul.
Well,
His own idea of what.
point of view. Everybody has their own point of view. If we stood on different corners out here at Broad and Burn, and something happened in the intersection, every one of us would have a different interpretation. It might be really similar, but we'd say, well, yes, but you forgot such and so, and you would tell me, well, I didn't see he was wearing a red sweater, and I didn't mention that, and that was important. So this is a quote from John Sailhammer in his book Introduction to the Old Testament. A photograph of a tree is a good example of the distinction between a text and an event depicted in it. A photograph is a representation of a tree, yet it does not have bark and leaves, nor is the sky behind the tree a real sky. To say that a photograph only represents the tree, but is not actually the tree, does not mean that the tree never existed, or that the photograph is inaccurate because it only shows one side of the tree. The same can be said of biblical narrative texts. To say they represent events but are not the events themselves is simply to recognize a very obvious fact about biblical narratives. They're texts, which means we stand not before the events, but a representation of the events through words. And the Gospels are a good example of this in that they vary in timeline and order of events and so forth. But part of that is, as each writer is recording them, they have a purpose for the way in which they've done it. And 4 different people, 4 different purposes. Now, you could say, well, the purpose is to tell about the life of Jesus. But when most people give a witness, do they simply tell about the life of Jesus? No. What they tell about is how Jesus affected their life. And in some ways, that's what happens in those gospel stories. We are hearing how Jesus affected their lives. Now, and that's not any less important, because what confirms that for us? Well, Luke wasn't there. He heard the word from others and was converted and still felt the need to tell about the life of Jesus. John Mark may have been present for some of the events, but not all of them. Matthew, John, but the main thing is that their experience of Jesus is different. Yet they still have an experience of Jesus, and that is not unimportant. We're going to stop our video at this point and see our first.
Ask you a question.
Yes.
When I always said, if anybody wants to start reading the Bible, read John.
Yes. Yes.
Do you think that makes a lot of difference?
I'm not sure that it does. If you want to get the closest to the date of the source, you would read Mark. But one of the things about John is, I believe sometimes people read the Gospels and see Jesus as the magic man because he does all these miracles. One of the beauties of John is he doesn't do that. He does some things, but John sees Jesus as the miracle, not the works that he wrought. And that's because that's his experience of him. I think sometimes, well, I know this to be true. We know people for long-term periods,
Yes.
maybe our spouses or friends we've had since we were very young, and we know what they were like back then.
Yeah.
But we also know what they're like now. And oftentimes, there's a big difference. There may not be day and night, but they've gained wisdom, they've
Right.
lost energy. And that doesn't make them any better or any worse, or any better or any worse. It's just that we've had this long experience of them, and we've been interpreting all along. When, if indeed the Apostle John wrote that gospel, he writes it late in life.
Yes.
And if that be the case, he's had the experience of being with Jesus. He's also had the experience of being with Jesus, not being in his physical presence. And he's had time to think and interpret and decide this was really important. This was not so important. I'm not even going to write about it. I would say this before we stop the video, and I usually say this in sermons often. Anytime you find a story that's in all four Gospels, my advice would be pay attention to it, because all four writers are suddenly agreeing that this was important. This was a seminal event. And indeed, the example from John is this. Next Easter, when we're looking at the various recountings of the Last Supper, what's missing from John's Last Supper? The supper.
Oh,
There's no recounting of the eating.
no.
There is in the other three Gospels. So where does John see communion? John sees communion in two different places. In the 21st chapter, when he meets with the disciples on the beach post-resurrection, and in the feeding of the 5,000. The feeding of the 5,000 is in all four Gospels. In John, as usual, it's not a short story. It goes on for an entire chapter, and it's a long chapter. So whenever we see the same story in all four Gospels, we should pay attention. All right, I'm going to stop this camera.
We're learning how to read different types of literature in the Bible. And we're going to start by talking about biblical narrative.
So narratives, in their most basic form, have characters in a setting going through a series of events. And how those events are selected and then arranged by an author, that's called the plot.
A basic plot line begins with a character in her setting. But then something new or unexpected happens, causing problems that lead up to some ultimate conflict, which is then resolved and the character finds herself changed, living in a new normal.
Now, in reading narratives, it's important to understand every scene in the context of its larger plot line. You can make the same story have a totally different message if you ignore where it occurs in the plot. This happens all the time when people read the Bible.
Really?
Yeah, take, for example, the story about Gideon. There's this well-known scene where Gideon's trying to discern whether God will help him win a battle, and he requests a sign from God.
Yeah, Gideon lays a wool fleece on the ground and asks that in the morning the fleece be wet with dew, but the ground totally dry, and God does it.
Now, if you look at this scene just by itself, what is the conflict?
How can Gideon know if he'll succeed?
And the resolution?
Test God, ask for a sign, and find out.
Yeah, and that's how many people actually read this story, and it totally misses the point, because it's ignoring the larger plot line.
Really?
Yeah, so let's start from the beginning, you'll get the context. The story begins with Gideon and the Israelites living in fear because they're oppressed by an invading people, the Midianites.
Got it.
Then there's the call to action. God commissions Gideon to defeat the Midianites and save Israel.
Yeah, this is shaping up to be a good story.
But then Gideon's super hesitant, so he asks God to do this magic trick, a sign, so I can know it's really you talking to me. And God stoops to his level. He gives him a sign by lighting this fire on an altar.
So Gideon's already asked for a sign.
And that's not all. In the next scene, God tells Gideon to tear down an altar to another god, but Gideon's so afraid, he does it at night.
So Gideon's skeptical and also a bit of a coward.
Then we come to the moment where Gideon's about to face the Midianites, and he's still uncertain, so he asks for another sign, the fleece. He says, I want to know if you'll save Israel by my hand.
And God gives him that sign.
And he's still uncertain, so he asks for even one more sign, which is just a variation of the previous sign.
Okay, so Gideon's asking for way too many signs.
Exactly. In the larger context, it's clear the plot conflict is not how can Gideon discern the mysterious will of God. The real conflict is, when will this guy get his act together and start trusting God?
Okay, so then what's the resolution?
We have to keep reading. So Gideon gathers this huge army, 30,000 soldiers to fight the Midianites, and God says, no, way too many men. He whittles the army down to 300.
Why would he do that?
Well, Gideon's been testing God, so now God returns the favor. He tells Gideon to arm these 300 soldiers with trumpets and torches, and then surround the Midianites at night and make all this noise in the hills, which sounds ridiculous, but Gideon does it. And the noise scares the Midianites into this frenzy. They start destroying each other in the dark while Gideon looks on safely from the hills.
So this story isn't offering the reader tips for discerning God's will.
No, it's about God's commitment to use weak people with deep flaws to do more than they could have imagined.
Okay, so short scenes, like Gideon and the fleece, are combined with other scenes making up a larger plot line. And tracing the conflict and resolution through the plot helps you see the message the author's trying to get across.
Now, Gideon's story has been set alongside many other stories that are also about these flawed, often questionable leaders called judges. And each of these has its own internal plot line. But then altogether they make up a whole movement of the biblical story, the period of the judges, and that has its own unified plot line.
And there are many movements within the story of the Bible.
Exactly. And all the smaller stories, hundreds of them, they fit within the context of their own movements. And then these movements together make up the building blocks of the grand plotline of the whole story of the Bible.
So no matter where I'm reading in the Bible, I need to pay attention to these different layers of plot so I can read each story in context.
Exactly. The Bible is such a sophisticated piece of literature. And so all these smaller plot lines keep overlapping, building up the tension. And when you back up, you can see how they've all been woven together into the unified story that leads to Jesus.
So, despite a few technical problems, we have just gotten an opportunity to see our first of the videos, and it will, as you will have already seen at your end of this, you will already have seen it. So we are moving on. The first thing we looked at today was plot, and that had to do with your reading of today, obviously. And the reason why it wasn't just the story of the fleece, because that's not the whole of the story, as they were pointing out. And that's just a small example of what we were talking about earlier. Now, obviously you can't sit down and read the entire Bible in one setting, but you don't do a book that way either. You read it in portions, the difference being in the Bible, you can read the portions out of order, but to get the full impact of the story, we try and consider both Old and New Testament. It's always interesting that the older I get, there's a lot of our adages that we've used through the years that don't apply anymore. When people say, well, I'm a New Testament Christian. Mm-hmm. Well, you know, you've left out a big portion of the entire story when you do that. Okay, plot is the arrangement of characters and events with a narrative to communicate a message. Now, as they pointed out, if you just read a portion of the story of Gideon, you end up having one view of him. Whereas if you read certainly the entire story of Gideon, you have another view of him. Indeed, in the book of Judges, lots of the judges are flawed, and I know it's not one of the more pleasant books of the Bible to read because it can be pretty gory. But it reminds us very importantly, it reminds us that God uses all types of people to get the work of his work done. And so the good news there is I'm not perfect. I'm not the best of anything, but the Lord can use me just like he used Gideon, just like he used Moses, who was a murderer and a stutterer, just like he uses Samson, who was a big-time carouser and did not lead a very righteous life, just like he used David, who has several flaws, but he used them to do great things. In reminding us again that the story of the Bible is one story, we tend to think of it being in tons of parts. But one of the things I liked about what they did was they point out that the truth is there are 4 parts of the Bible. 2 testaments, but only 4 parts. There's really the story of creation to exile. I know that covers a ton of territory. But God creates the world, picks his people, they fail, and he sends them into exile. Then from there, you have the story of the covenanting or recovenanting with Israel. And so that's pretty much the rest of the Old Testament. Starting, take your pick. Either you can start with the wisdom literature, which much of that is certainly may have been written earlier, but is not constructed into a grouping until the exile. And the third portion, of course, is the Gospels. Now, that seems awfully short, but think about everything that's in the Gospels. And then, obviously, the kingdom comes, and we have the period of the, I guess what you'd say, new creation to, new kingdom to new creation. The kingdom of God leads us eventually to, people always talk about the end of the world, but it's actually the reinvention of the world. So that basically, in those 4 things, you have the entire story of the Bible. That also gets us from choosing human beings to choosing a group, a chosen group of human beings, to sending the new man, as Paul referred to him, to now choosing every human being again, but individually, as opposed to as a group. And that's where one of our old adages does strike home for me. We talk about your personal relationship with Jesus Christ, but it's not personal in that sense of, this is my relationship with Jesus Christ and it's none of your business. This is my relationship with Jesus Christ and how it relates me to everybody else. Okay, so that is plot, and they did a very good job with that, as they do with everything else that they do. When you did your Bible reading, did any of it, did you gain a different view of Gideon? I know you didn't, because you probably already knew all the story.
I thought, I don't need to read this. I've read this how many times? But you know, you do. You get a fresh view of how you would react to what he wanted from God.
Is there any wisdom bit from our society that you would apply to Gideon? Because when I read this story, especially the 2 portions of the fleece, I always say, boy, he's hedging his bets. He's hedging his bets. Yeah. He wants to know this is a sure thing. And of course, I don't know that he ever thinks of it as a sure thing, especially as they pointed out when God decides to test Gideon a little bit. Well, just one quick further delve in the plot line. As there are different types of poems to accomplish different things, there are also different types of narrative that can accomplish different things. And one of the things they point out are what we used to refer to in our Bible study in seminary as ascent stories or descent stories. Now, they also point out that in literature, those can also be referred to as comedies and tragedies. But I like the ascent stories and the descent stories, and they are exactly what they say. What's an ascent story? It's when the character starts in one place and the whole plot shows how he or she becomes a better person. And those, and both of these are kind of morality tales, but in those types of stories, who do we like to identify with?
The ascending.
Yes.
You bet. You bet. Because we do have this inner desire, I believe, to become better than we've been. Well, obviously, what's the flip side of that coin? The descent stories, and as you can probably figure out, they introduce us to a character who's at whatever stage of life, and what we see is their fall or their personal tragedy.
Like Judas Iscariot.
Yes, we see their downfall, and obviously, what is the moral of the tale there? Is it be like this person? No, it's don't be like this person. And in those kinds of stories, normally, we identify with, or we don't identify with the character, and at the end of the story, we are ready to not be like that person.
Right.
The second video here is about character. If I can get this turned off.
When I started to get into that,
We're talking about how to read biblical narrative, or in other words, how to read stories.
Right. And one of the main ingredients of any good story is characters who encounter conflict and then have to overcome it.
Yeah, let's talk about characters. In most stories, we quickly identify with characters because, just like them, we're in our own story having our own conflicts that we need to overcome.
Yeah, and good stories have characters with relatable struggles. We can watch them react to these challenges in different ways, and we get to see what happens as a result. Through characters, an author can show us their view of what it means to be human. The Bible's no different. Biblical stories use characters as a mirror so we can see ourselves and discover our own human nature in the reflection.
The thing about characters in the Bible is that they can be hard to relate to. I mean, often there's very little detail given about them.
Yeah, biblical authors develop characters differently than modern narratives. They prefer to communicate a lot through minimal detail. For example, we rarely hear what people look like in the Bible, but when we do, it's crucially important for the story.
Like we're told that Saul is tall and David was kind of a runt.
And these become images of their moral character. Saul's height matches his love of status and power to impose authority, while David humbly accepts his low status and allows God to exalt and deliver him.
So people's physical appearances are symbolic.
Yeah, very often. Like Esau's hairy body fits his animal-like behavior, and Jacob's smooth skin matches his deceptive, slippery nature.
What other clues do we get about biblical characters?
Well, often people's names symbolize their role in the story. Abraham in Hebrew sounds like father of a multitude. Jacob means deceiver. Ruth means refreshment. And Saul, his name means the one asked for. He's the flawed king that the people requested.
So by packing all this meaning with very little detail, biblical stories can do a lot in a little space.
And they even leave out things that modern readers want to know about these characters. Like they rarely come out and tell us people's thoughts or motives.
Right, like when Moses saw an Egyptian beating an Israelite, he kills him on the spot. But why? Was this righteous anger, or did he just lose his cool? And was it okay with God that he did it?
Yeah, we're not told. told, because biblical authors usually avoid giving moral commentary. They would rather have a character's words and actions reveal their motives, and then leave us to judge their behavior by seeing the consequences. So in the case of Moses, this murders the beginning of a pattern of his anger getting the best of him with bad results. This choice forces him to run and hide in the desert for 40 years.
So it was a bad thing. But he does meet his wife out there, so it's a good thing?
Exactly. It forces you to ponder. Through all these techniques, the biblical narrators keep their stories compact, memorable, but also engaging.
But seriously, was Moses being good or bad? Right? Like in classic stories, there's always a good guy and a bad guy, some admirable hero who faces off against some horrible villain.
Sure, and simplified characters like that are helpful for teaching children there's such a thing as good and evil. But the Bible's not a children's book. Its characters are very complex, a mixed bag of good and evil, just like us. There's hardly any flawless characters in the Bible.
What about heroes of the faith, like Abraham or King David?
So you mean Abraham, who used an Egyptian slave for sex and then lied about his wife 2 times to save his own neck? And David, the man after God's own heart, who sleeps with another man's wife and then murders him? These stories are anything but simplistic. They offer us realistic portraits of compromised people like ourselves. The real surprise is that God keeps working with them despite their failures.
So, just because a person's called by God or wins a battle, becomes successful or wealthy, it doesn't mean the biblical author wants me to act like them.
Right. It would actually be really dangerous to imitate most biblical characters.
True. But there must be something admirable in biblical characters, something I can imitate.
Absolutely. Pay attention, and you'll notice that most biblical stories highlight the moments when characters fail or come to the end of themselves, and then they choose radical trust in God's grace and wisdom. It's in these stories that the authors show us how to be a human who truly pleases God through humility and surrender.
Yeah, the fact that God stays committed to biblical characters is a profound statement about the patience and love of God, who is also a character.
Right. And by studying biblical characters, we can observe our own worst tendencies on display. And we see time and again God's gracious response that will see this story through to the end.
Look how God used David, even though he wasn't perfect.
And it's amazing how terrible they all were.
Yes.
I mean,
If
they were
you-
so
you
immoral.
could say, well, God uses everybody,
Yeah.
that he can use it. So,
And as flawed as I am, God can use me. And
Right,
he can
he
use
has to use
whoever.
that's very good there.
He had to use flawed people so that he could get
So we could relate.
Absolutely, because we're bad, aren't we?
Not as
We're
bad
not.
as
We're
these
not
people.
that bad,
Well,
but
we're not bad.
but God forgives us of our
Sin
sins,
is sin.
and so He had to use those people.
Yeah.
So the biblical authors use characters as vehicles for their message primarily through showing rather than telling. They don't make value judgments on the things that happen. They leave that for us to do.
Okay.
Biblical characters are not meant to be people we try and emulate. In fact, they often represent how not to act. But the biblical authors use them to communicate the morals and ethics of a godly life. And so one of the things that they point out in the further study material, that they point out in the video as well, is that it's important for us to pay attention to the details that we are given about characters, because the truth is biblical authors are not interested in details about characters. Oftentimes we get a name and then we immediately spring into action as to what they did. But they're reminding us, if we ever are told anything about their physical appearance, pay particular attention to it, because it probably says something about them. Why did Samuel choose Saul as the first king of Israel?
I thought it's because he was good looking.
Well, that's almost 100% right. It's at least 60% right. He chose him because he looked like a king. If they had called Central Casting on the phone and said, we need somebody that looks like a king, they would have sent Saul. They would not have sent David.
Right.
Who was the better king? David. Okay. All right. Moral evaluation of characters. Action is oftentimes not given. However, that doesn't mean it's never given. And so sometimes we'll hear these phrases that so-and-so did evil, so-and-so did good, so-and-so was righteous, so-and-so was wise. If you hear that, pay attention to it. It's telling you something very important about that person. It is important to note when they tell us of favoritism in a story, because it's going to impact the story. Who was Isaac's favorite?
Esau.
Who was Rebekah's favorite?
Jacob.
And while both of them, as was pointed out, are flawed characters in the beginning, what we find out is one of them has the ability to ascend or become better, and it's Jacob.
Right.
But he shouldn't have gotten the blessing.
No.
And the way he gets it is pretty dubious, to say the least.
Well, for one thing, he was born just, Jacob was, I mean, there was that not that much distance between
Heel
the time they were
grabber.
born.
Yeah, he's holding on to his
you know what
brother's
I mean.
His
foot.
mother put him up to it anyway.
Uh-huh.
His mother put him up to it anyway.
Oh,
Yeah.
no.
But their names are meant to imply the same thing that their appearances do. Esau is rough and unappreciative and will never be the kind of guy that can understand the blessing. And don't get me wrong, according to the biblical text, he did well. He had a good life.
Yes, they did.
But he was not the one chosen to carry the blessing, the promise. And so, although, I can't get too deep.
Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they, that's one of the three characters in the Bible that I think started out at a high point and left on a high point.
And I love their statement about the reasoning for not recanting. They said, God will save us. And even if he doesn't, it's still the right thing to do. Okay, so another thing to keep in mind is character names. And we know this to be true from the Bible. A lot of times when we are told a character's name, we are told what it sounds like in Hebrew, or what it's close to in some other language. And that's going to be a reflection of their character. So as you point out, when he's born, he's a little heel grabber. Now that's not a complimentary thing to say about somebody, but he's going to get better. Okay. Their actions, characters are something the biblical authors tend to speak with rather than about. Instead of moralizing about a character's decisions, biblical narrators simply show you the decisions and consequences of that character's actions and allow you to ponder the significance. As I was saying, in some ways, the Gospel of Mark is like a really long sermon, and it ends so strangely by saying the women kept silent. But we know they didn't, because you're hearing this sermon. And so it's almost Mark's way of saying, well, what do you think? What are you going to do now? You make a decision. You decide where your life's going from this point. Speeches are very important to listen to. And of course, we already talked about God as the main character of the Bible. So if there's any juice left here, I saw that we got that little message about it running out, but we have one more, and this has to do with setting. Hello? Have I done everything wrong today?
There we go.
Ah, hallelujah. Let me get this.
It's a lady is slow.
Yeah.
It says it's low.
It's slow.
In every story you've ever heard, the action took place somewhere, and that place is called the setting. And since we've been learning how to read biblical narratives, let's talk about how settings work in the Bible.
So, settings are a crucially important tool in the hands of the biblical authors.
Really?
Yeah, think of it this way. When you start a story, everything is new. The plot and the characters are a mystery until things unfold.
Yeah, we have no idea what to expect.
Except, authors can use the setting of a story to prepare you for what's coming.
How so?
Well, let's say a story begins in a courtroom. What do you think is going to happen?
I expect a story about crime and justice.
Yeah, or how about the setting of a dark, old, rundown house?
Oh, something scary is about to happen.
Exactly. So settings evoke memories and emotions because of other stories you know that happened in similar places. The authors know this, and they can use settings to generate expectations about what could happen in this story. And a good author will get creative with settings, and he'll mess with your expectations in order to make a point.
This happens in the Bible?
All over the place. For example, think about the setting Egypt in the Bible.
Yeah, big Middle Eastern empire on the Nile.
Sure. Now think about the first biblical story where someone ends up in Egypt. It's about Abraham. God calls him to journey by faith to a new land, and he promises to give him a huge family. So he sets out, but he arrives during a famine. Now, is he going to trust God and stay in the promised land? Or will he leave the land and go look for food on his own?
Yeah, Abraham leaves and goes down to Egypt.
And there, in Egypt, things go downhill fast. Abraham denies that Sarah is his wife to save his own neck, and then Pharaoh tries to marry her for himself.
Okay, first impression of Egypt, not a great place to visit.
But God then rescues them. He strikes Egypt with plagues, and so Pharaoh relents and sends Abraham away with loads of wealth. So, what do we learn about Egypt as a setting from this story?
It's the place people end up because of stupid decisions, but it's also a place where God comes and rescues his people.
Yep, and the next main story in Egypt follows the same pattern. Abraham's great-grandsons make a bunch of stupid choices, and they eventually lead them to Egypt because of another famine.
Down in Egypt, uh-oh.
So generations pass, and the family ends up as slaves in Egypt, and what do you think's gonna happen?
God's gonna send some plagues and rescue his people.
It's like he saw it coming. After the Israelites get back to the Promised Land, God tells them to never go back to Egypt for any reason. It's the place of trouble and oppression.
So when future biblical characters go to Egypt, I'm supposed to cringe.
Right. Like Solomon, at the peak of his wealth and power, he married the king of Egypt's daughter, and then he started sending Israelites there to import Egyptian stallions. And then, a generation later, that alliance goes bad. Egypt oppresses Israel all over again.
So biblical settings carry with them all these memories of previous stories, which create expectation.
Yeah, it's a brilliant literary device to infuse stories with meaning. Now, biblical authors, they're brilliant. They can build up your expectations, but also creatively mess with them.
Like how?
Egypt's a perfect example. In the Gospel of Matthew, when Jesus is born, his family flees to Egypt.
Uh-oh, so this is a problem.
You would think so, but pay attention. Instead of Egypt being the bad place, it's the place of safety. Because who are they fleeing from? King Herod, who is behaving exactly like Pharaoh did, but he rules Jerusalem, not Egypt.
Matthew is messing with me to show how Jerusalem has become Egypt.
Exactly. You can find these kinds of patterns in many different biblical settings. Babylon, Moab, the wilderness, Bethlehem. The list goes on.
Which is a big list.
And it gets bigger, because sometimes the setting isn't just a place on a map. It's a type of situation, but they work the same way that settings do. For example, when people move toward the east, expect trouble. Adam and Eve were banished to the east, and then Cain wanders to the east.
People move to the east to build Babylon.
And all of these narratives are designed to point forward to when the Israelites as a people will be exiled to the east in Babylon.
Ah, nice.
Which leads to one more type of setting in biblical narrative, and that's time, or how long events take. Like, time periods of 40 are often associated with stories where people's faithfulness is tested. Noah in the boat for 40 days and 40 nights. Then he gets off and gets totally drunk. The Israelites got impatient during their 40 days of waiting for Moses on Mount Sinai, so they made the golden calf. Or after the Israelite spies investigate the land for 40 days, the people rebel, so they have to wander in the desert for 40 years.
But then there's the story of Jesus, who was tested in the desert for 40 days, and he reverses the expectation. He overcomes the test.
Exactly. Across the whole Bible, places, situations, and time periods become full of meaning by evoking memories and setting expectations. And the New Testament authors reuse all of these settings to show how Jesus is the one carrying our world from the garden, out of Egypt and the wilderness, and into the new creation.
Say the number 7 is Jesus and the number 8 is God. Anybody ever?
Well,
thought that?
3 is the perfect number,
Yes.
representing the Trinity. 4 is the human number because it's God plus 1. But the point that you're making, the larger point you're making, is important. That numbers have meanings, and when you find numbers within the narrative, they're not just there. There's a reason why. Now, take for example the numbers given in the book of Numbers about the population. If you had that larger group moving around the Sinai desert, we would have all sorts of things that are being dug up today that show us of their movement, but we don't. So were those numbers that large? I don't think so. But why did they record them as being that large? Because the author is trying to impress upon you that the Lord, even while Israel is in the wilderness, the Lord is blessing those people. You know, we would think of that as a bad time, but they are not supposed to think of it that way. And the historians have gone back to ensure that what we're remembering is God was blessing the people, manna, water when they need it, keeping them safe from enemies, and they are multiplying. Now,
Millions.
yes, you cannot expect a better life, I guess is what I'm trying to say. But of course they were being punished.
I've never had any student ask me how they could look at 1 million people at a time. That's a good question. I don't know how I could have answered that. Because they say millions.
Yes.
Millions.
Yes,
You know?
it's numbers beyond expectation, but so sometimes, you know, you might just go ahead and take numbers and divide them by 10 right off the bat to get a more accurate
Well, when Moses
vision.
came off the mountain the final time, and the ground opened up and swallowed a portion of them.
Yeah.
And that was one of the reasons God had them go through that 40 years.
Right.
Yeah.
So they could be replaced, because everyone that was there at that point in day and time that went against God never made it to the new promised land.
I know it's an oversimplification, but this shows too many years of youth ministry. I always say that the wandering in the wilderness were the teenage years of the Israelites. And most parents have had that point where they would have liked to have sent their teenager out into the wilderness until they got grown. So anyway, to finish up very quickly here, the action of every story takes place somewhere, and that place is called the setting. Biblical authors use the setting as a tool in biblical narratives to evoke memories and emotions and to generate expectations about what could happen in the story. Physical places and locations serve as settings, but time also serves as a type of setting. Of course, they went over all that in the video. As the biblical story develops, places and situations begin to take on symbolic or meaningful significances based on what has happened there. And indeed, and this would have been nice to have said this during our poetry portion, but in the Psalms, this becomes incredibly important, because not only settings, but also groups of peoples are used for, I guess what I'd call it is coloring. In other words, or shorthand. You can say that place, and I don't have to explain how badly somebody's acted or how terrible it's going to be, because they know from past stories what those things are. It goes on to say, think about common settings in modern films, such as Westerns, and how each location has a genre associated with the like action the movie sets, whether it's a fast-paced movie set in New York, a romance set in Paris, or a Western set in a dusty ghost town. So there you go. Places that hold significance in the overall Bible study include Egypt, Moab, the wilderness, Bethlehem, and Jerusalem. And of course you can think of others pretty much right off the bat. Time, or how long things take, also serves as a type of biblical setting. You can tell which events are most meaningful to the author's message by what gets the most airtime. And this is a good thing to remember. In the book of Mark, chapters 1 through 10 cover pretty much the entire ministry of Jesus. It's only 10 chapters long. But 11 through 16, or let me back up. Chapters 1 through 10 covers the ministry. Whether it was 3 years or 1 year, 10 chapters. But the remaining 6 chapters only cover 8 days. Palm Sunday to Easter Sunday.
Okay. Right.
Now, I don't know percentages, but I know this, that 10's not much larger than 6, and it's a much longer period of time. Does that mean it's less important? No. But sometimes I think of it in terms of it takes 6 chapters to put in real context the first 10 chapters. All right, so next week.
Gospel. It's a very good gospel.
Oh, they all are. They all are.
But the Mark is good. We set him aside.
Yes.
If you were to say in order, people don't come out. If you were in a congregation and say, which is your favorite gospel? John. And then Luke. And then Matthew. And then Mark. Don't you think?
Well, I like Mark because it's the closest in time to the original source material.
I like it. Yeah.
And the other thing I like about it is it's deceptive in that we think of it as being short and concise, but as we've learned from what we've done in both poetry and narrative at this point, concise is not a bad thing. And it does not subtract from meaning. So Mark may be the gospel of action, and it all takes place very quickly, but speed reading is not the way to approach the Bible.
Teachers would write back, too wordy.
Yes.
Yeah, really.
Well, let's close with a word of prayer. Gracious God, as we look through this material on the narratives that are left for us in the Bible, help us to see they are rich with meaning if we will but take the time to seek it out and understand. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
See you next
Thank
week.
you.
And the assignment will be in the bulletin.
I haven't heard anything else yet. No news is good news.
Good.
What was the question?
She asked me how my sister was doing. I said,
At least he was in the story ends that he lived a good life. He didn't let us down. Last night I reread the whole thing. And I said, well, praise the Lord. I had something good in scripture because he really, if you were to ask somebody now, they'd go tell you the police. That's the story, the whole story about Gideon. But the ending is the prettiest part.
Oh, yes. The ascent. It's not a descent story, it's an ascent story.
Or a
You know,
decent.
I'm sorry that 50, 100 people aren't listening to this, because I tell you, the people, the Bible, would understand their Bible more if they were listening to this lesson. I'm telling you.
Well, you can share it.
Yeah. I don't know, I don't think we want to hear that.
All right. Y'all have a wonderful day and week until I see you next
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Wednesday night.
Thank you.
Thank you, and you'll give us
That's
a,
right,
you'll give us a new,
Katana.
you'll give us a new assignment.
Yes, it'll be in the bulletin on Sunday.
Good.
I've got to get upstairs, and that's one of many things to work on. And I've got to get Al to show me what I did wrong with this.
Janet this afternoon, and maybe
there's nothing like that
perhaps
stuff.
executive board, three of us.
I'm always
sit
terrified
down
of these things.
I'm here and-
Well, just when you think you know exactly what you're doing, something happens and you realize, I guess I don't know exactly what I'm doing. Whoops. I hope y'all had a good weekend.
No, listen.
Yes.
What is it, starting the process?
Well, I hope it was good. What is the name of the lady up in the stairs in the on the team? Yes. Kristen told me yesterday that she's getting ready to take off for the winter. So I wanted to pass that on to Al or Angie or somebody that so they know that.
Right.
We were talking after church.
Yeah.
Whew.
She may have told Angie, I don't know. But she's been pretty spotty in anything all the time. But, yeah, it's really been quite a juggling act for Angie. She actually hadn't had any day off for 2 years. She hadn't had any day where she didn't have to do something, either for her mother or her job, or something related to here. And so she got all her 2 days away this week.
Well, she deserves them. And we had a good chili thing. We practically sold that.
Really good.
And they were commenting at church that they had a good turnaround. So we thought it was, when Christy and I were here for a couple hours, we thought it was a good turnaround, but you never know because you don't have anything to compare it to. I'm going to put this up before I lose it. All right. But it was a good day yesterday.
Good.
Everybody. June, I don't want to say June. Right, I'm gonna write each letter, tell we voted to combine our group. This will be the last time we're at the group.
Oh.